All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well. Commercial training week 2. I think we all rather be out sunbathing this afternoon than talking about commercial. It sure looks like it's going to be a beautiful day out there. So I hope some of you can take advantage of a lovely day and maybe go for a nice walk or something like that this afternoon. It sure looks like a beauty shaping up out there. My goodness, what a great treat to have at the end of October, close to the end of October. Wow, I love it. So welcome. For those of you who handed in your homework late, I will try to get back to it, back to you guys later this afternoon. If not, it'll be perhaps early next week, but I will answer those people who sent in their homeworks a little bit late. I will definitely get back to you for sure. So in regards to the homework, one of the main questions in the homework was to try to determine why there are different capitalization rates between two different companies. And I think the overall idea of having you look at why there are different capitalization rates for different companies is to realize that a capitalization rate, it's a ballpark, you guys. It's not an exact thing. Does it get pricing, and does it get NOI, and does it get value of businesses into the ballpark? Yes. Is it an exact science? No, it definitely is not. And as the examples are here on your screen, you can see, low-rise apartment A with CBRE has a range, and then Cushman has a totally different range. And if you look at that range, CBRE could be 3 and Cushman could be 4.5 for a low-rise apartment. That's a big spread. And the whole idea behind the homework assignment is that you kind of realize that it's not an exact science. It's different depending on which company you use, which number that you use. But the other important part is, why does this happen? And it generally happens because they have different metrics on measuring the values. So Cushman, which is obviously in the low-rise apartment A's, obviously has perhaps looking at better income statements than CBRE is. I'm sorry, other way around. Sorry, CBRE is looking at better income statements than Cushman is for the same low-rise apartment, what they classify as a low-rise apartment. And the other part that is kind of behind the scenes that we don't know about is perhaps low-rise apartment A for CBRE. Perhaps that low-rise apartment has just recently had a new parking garage made. Maybe it's had a new roof put on. Maybe the owners of the property have put in windows 2 or 3 years ago, where perhaps the ones for Cushman has not. And so there's definitely changes in the capitalization rates dependent on economic factors, such as in low-rise apartment A, maybe Cushman's apartments are finding more vacancies, that their vacancy rate is higher, and CBRE's vacancy rates are lower. And so you have to take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt, which I know, because we're going to look at the math again in a second, kind of flies in the face of the math that seems like an exact thing, but it's not an exact science. It gets you close, all right? It's not perfect because it depends, in this case, in low-rise apartment A, which one? In Class A industrial, it's the same kind of idea. CBRE 4.25 and Cushman has a 5. That's a big swing over $1 million in terms of how much they're asking and how much their NOI is. And so you just have to keep in mind that perhaps it's not perfect. It gets you into the ballpark, okay? Oops, sorry. So back to this, now I'm going backwards a little bit from last week, just as a reminder how this works. Remember that it is inversely proportional. So the higher the capitalization rate, the lower the value of the business, all right? And why is that? Is because capitalization rates are a measure of risk. Now, we had a great example of this. Andy, if you're here, I'm going to pick on what we talked about earlier this week. Andy ran into a buyer that wanted an 8 to 10% capitalization rate for an investment property, and said, "Andy, find me a property that has 8 to 10%." And he found if I remember correctly, it was a sixplex in Alliston that they were asking $1.6 million for. And the net operating income was about $38,000, if I remember correctly. And it certainly did not work out. Now, was it overpriced? Yes, because the capitalization rate turned out to be about 2.75%. Now, if you have a capitalization rate of 2.75%, why would anybody invest in that property at 2.75%? Okay. The reason why I go, why would anybody do that, is because I can take $1.6 million and pretty much get through a government bond, probably 3.5% through the Canadian government bonds, or even a municipal bond. You can buy those and get 3 or 4% with virtually no risk. Okay. And so probably an investor won't pay that asking price for it because it's too high. Now, there is one caveat to that. And the caveat to that is, just backing up again for a second, it's the 2.75% is a lousy capitalization rate because you can be in a risk-free environment with a government bond. But the caveat to that is, can you tear down the building and put up a 14 or 15 or 18 story condo? And maybe then it's the value of the land. And so you do have to watch capitalization rates fairly closely. That in this case here, Alliston won't let you put up an 18-story building, by the way, not in the downtown core where this was located. But sometimes, you're going to look at the value of a business and look at a capitalization rate, and it doesn't make sense at all. But can the property be used for a highest and best use? And I think I saw Gloria's name on here. Gloria and I had a long conversation about that a week or two ago about another property where probably the value of the business was probably only worth, $2.5 million, $2.75 million with a good cap rate. It was a 6.5% cap rate. But could you build something high on there? And yes, I think you probably can, according to the zoning. And maybe it is worth $4 million because when you build a 10-story condo on that building, then the capitalization rate is kind of thrown out the window by a scenario called highest and best use. Now, for those of you who've just graduated recently from your colleges, you've done highest and best use. For those of you who've taken the appraisal course as your sixth, elective, then you also should be familiar with highest and best use. I'm not going to get into highest and best use today, but if you want to Google it on your own to check out what highest and best use means in real estate, then that might be an interesting project for you if you really want to go down that road. So once again, capitalization rates are a measure of risk. Okay, somebody wants a 14% return, such as the second one in value here, 14% return. 14% return is great, right? I mean, I'd love a 14% return, but there's a higher risk involved with a 14% return. Maybe next year you only get a 2% return. Maybe next year you get an 18% return. Maybe next year you get a 3% return. Where if your cap rate is 5%, you probably have a pretty good chance of getting a 5% return year in, year out, year in, year out, where the 14% return is going to be up and down like a yo-yo. And maybe one day, because of some economic factors called COVID, it's not going to work at all, where that 5% return is probably going to continue to work throughout something economically devastating such as COVID. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the capitalization rates? Or is everybody thinking about the summer day out there? Okay, we'll just move on then. So just a quick review from cap rates. What do cap rates mean? High cap rate means a lower purchase price. A low cap rate translates into a higher sale value for the seller. For the buyer, a low cap rate means less risk. For the seller, a high cap rate relates to a more difficult sale because of the risk involved. And it tries to adjust for that. We talked about this one last week. So, definition of a capitalization rate. For an all cash purchase, okay, we're going to go a little bit further into this now. For an all cash purchase, a $1 million NOI and a $17 million value, 5.9%. Okay, for the investor could maybe get a 5.9% return. The lower the cap rate, the better the chances of that return happening. Okay, simple as that on a cash purchase. But what happens if it's not a cash buyer? You have to actually calculate the return, and that is called a return on investment, or an ROI. All right, so if you're not a cash buyer, what is the actual return going to be on an investment? ROI. An ROI can tell the investor an actual percentage return for any specified segment of time. It allows the investor to manipulate the NOI of a company at expenses, for example, a mortgage payment. So the ROI will tell the average profit displayed as a percentage over a specified period of time. But now we're not a cash purchase anymore. We are now going to manipulate the operating income to fit the buyer's actual rate of return on their investment, their ROI. So for a $1 million investment and a $75,000 NOI, it's pretty straightforward. The cap rate is 7.5% with no other anticipated expenses going forward. Pretty straightforward, okay? But now we're going to assume a yearly mortgage payment of $35,000. So what happens? What happens is that the return is lowered to 4%. Why? $75,000 minus $35,000 mortgage payment is $40,000, right? If your investment is $1 million and your operating income is $40,000, you have reduced your return. Your cap rate is basically down from 7.5%, but now the answer is 4%. Okay, now I have to qualify this. Not exact, because the interest expense is not accounted for here. Okay, I'm just doing the straight math just to show you guys how an investor will actually look at what they are going to do. Okay, so it was looking good at 7.5%. But my rate of return on investment is actually only 4%, because I have to pay $35,000 more for the mortgage. So now we go a little bit deeper into this. Purchase price is $1 million. The year one NOI is $75,000. You have a mortgage payment of $35,000, but the buyer also needs to purchase a new truck. Okay. He also has to update and paint the offices. So your total expenses in year one, you actually have a loss of $10,000 in year one, okay? Assuming the NOI stays roughly the same. In year two, the NOI goes up a little bit because you bought that new truck. Your offices are nice and spiffy, so you make a few more sales. So you have the year two NOI of $85,000. Your year two expenses, your mortgage stays the same. You're going to buy a second truck, okay? Now your year two profit is $10,000. You've actually made a little bit of money on this one now. Year three NOI is $95,000. You're doing this. Your year three expenses, you have the same mortgage. You've now had to hire somebody else because your NOI has gone up. It's just not happening just because it's, you're too busy to handle it. But now your year three profit is still pretty good, $40,000. Your total 3-year profit is $40,000, right? In year one, you lost $10,000. In year two, you gained $10,000. In year three, you gained $40,000. So your 3-year profit is $40,000. Well, that's nice. What is your actual return on investment? Is 1.33%. So now it's not looking quite so good on a return on investment. Now you're only making 1.33%. You're not making 7.5% on the cap rate, right? This is what an investor will be looking for. What am I actually going to make? Okay, you can imagine now that 14% that we talked about earlier, that 14% capitalization rate, just let me go back there. This 14% capitalization rate, right? Now it's going to get your return on investment. If you're going to add all sorts of stuff into there, it's not going to look so good anymore, is it? So this is why sometimes when agents are dealing with a buyer who's an investor, and the buyer has asked for a cap rate of, 6%, that's what they'd like. And then you find them one as the cap rate of 6%. Yay, we found one. Hooray, it's beautiful. It's absolutely wonderful. And the investor does this kind of, this is obviously a pretty simple, number game that I'm trying to present to you here. But all of a sudden the investor goes, nah, I'm not so interested in that. Why aren't you? We found an 8% or 7% cap rate, exactly what you want. Well, it just doesn't really look as good as I thought it would, and they have gone through these kind of steps to see what their return on investment is, your ROI. So back to Andy's case that we talked about a little earlier there, just a few minutes ago, the investor's looking at a 6% cap rate or 7% cap rate or 8% cap rate. And now he's going to have to take away all the things that need to be done to this sixplex. Maybe they have to put on a new roof. Maybe he's going to borrow $1.3 million to pay for the $1.7 million ask price. First of all, in that example, the cap rate stunk right from the beginning because it was too high, but his return on investment is going to get lower and lower and lower when he starts to add this kind of stuff in. And all of a sudden, your investor buyer disappears off the face of the earth because the ROI just doesn't come back to where a return on investment makes sense. Now, you always have to remember that once again, what is the highest and best use of the property? All right. So maybe what would happen is that they'd be happy at 1.33% per year, knowing that in 4 or 5 years, they can apply for a different zoning for the property to build something that's going to have a better return. Maybe they know that they're buying a plaza and the return is only 1 or 2%. Their ROI is only 1 or 2%. But maybe they know in their back pocket that Tim Hortons wants to put a standalone building on the parking lot, and then their ROI is going to go up. And so they're going to add things to their net operating income here, okay, to make this even better, to bring this number up a little bit, okay? That they know that a Esso wants to put a gas station on the corner, and Esso is going to pay them $80,000 a year in rent, or $180,000 a year is probably more closer to the truth, in rent. So it's not only expenses that a potential buyer will look at, they will also look at, possible increase in revenue. Now, when we get to that point of a possible increase in revenue, some sellers are saying, you can buy this property. Yes, I'm asking a lot of money for it, but you could get, for example, in a restaurant, this restaurant is not licensed, and you could get a liquor license, which will probably improve your net operating income. Some buyers will go for that, and some buyers will go, no. Why will some buyers go for that? Is because they know that they can get a liquor license and they can do it. Other buyers won't do it because a bank will only look at past history in terms of lending money for a mortgage. They will not lend on a maybe next year. All right. And so do keep that in mind as well. You need to pre-qualify these folks, your buyers, prior to dealing with them. I had a phone call the other day that somebody wanted to purchase a $2.2 million price property, and the seller wanted to see a goodness gracious me, it's gone right out of my head. a report from the mortgage broker or bank that they were qualified for it. The buyer didn't want to do it. The buyer did not want to produce that they have been pre-approved for a mortgage, right? That's the word I'm looking for, is pre-approved. And the buyer didn't want to do that. And my question to the agent was, well, how come you haven't had them pre-approved before you've even gone further, right? With investors, you know, it's not much different from a residential story that, you know, are you going to waste your time with these people, or are you going to get them pre-approved first? And I highly recommend you get them pre-approved first, especially in commercial. Any questions about this? You guys are letting me off easy again. All right. So there's a whole formula here. If you want to really study it, take a picture on your phone of this slide and you can figure it out, but there it is. That's the whole thing right there. And I know it might be, it's just math really, but investors are looking at return on investment. The capitalization rate is a guideline, okay? Oh, let me just go back. So before we leave this, one more time, questions, because now we're going to get into commercial leases next. Okay. Commercial leases, we're going to switch tacks here. It's enough math and talking about capitalization rates and ROI. It is really important for sales. I mean, I can go on, and we do go on back into sales. But what I have found is that if we break it up a little bit, then it's a little more enjoyable instead of me just droning on about the same thing. Commercial leases, types of leases. And I'm just going to go to the next slide because there's a couple more as well. And so there are a bunch of different types of leases. There's gross leases, okay, most common for office space. And you can pay a flat monthly amount. The landlord is responsible for all expenses of operating the building, including taxes, insurance, and repairs. You can believe me, tenants like gross leases. They know exactly the fixed amount that they have to pay, okay? That's what they want, okay? They are rare. Gross leases are rare. Net leases. A net lease requires that the tenant pays for some or all of the real estate taxes on the property. And the reason why it's some or all is because if you are in a net lease in a plaza, you're going to pay your proportionate share of taxes depending on the square footage. Maybe there's common areas in there as well. You might pay for all of the taxes if it's a standalone building, okay? But the building operating costs are the responsibility of the landlord. A net lease means that you have taxes and insurance that you have to pay for. And once again, the tenant would pay, if it's a standalone building, it would be insurance and taxes. If it's in a plaza or in an office building or something like that, once again, it would be divided amongst the square footage of the relative square footage of the property overall compared to what you have. So if it's 1,000 square foot building and you only have 100 square feet, you would pay 1/10. A net or triple net lease means that the net leases pass on all the costs of operating the building, taxes, maintenance, and insurance. And this is what we see most often. We see TMI, taxes, maintenance, and insurance, referred to TMI. And these costs are passed on to the renter. And most, I would think, most office space and retail space, TMI is passed on to the tenant, okay, as a relative cost related to the square footage of the property. The last one on here is a percentage lease, and I don't think you guys will get into too many of percentage leases. A percentage lease means that the tenant has to give some percentage of the rent to the landlord. Some percentage of gross income to the landlord. An example of that is in malls. You know, when you're in a mall and you're walking down the aisle in the mall, and there's a sunglass seller, or there's a seller in there that sells cell phone covers. You know, the cover of a cell phone. I'm sure you guys, there's other ones that sell T-shirts, that kind of things in malls. They generally are on percentage leases. They pay a very small amount of the floor space that they occupy, but they get over a certain threshold of sales, and the landlord will take a percentage of their gross income. You probably won't get into those kind of things. A mall like Yorkdale has percentage leases. So the Gap in Yorkdale pays a fixed amount of rent. They pay a certain percentage of the TMI of the place. And when they get over a certain gross income that's negotiated, they have to pay a certain amount, a percentage of their gross income to the landlord in Yorkdale, which is, I think, is it Grinwin in Yorkdale? I can't remember. The bottom line in here in red is, and this is so true, and I know Chris would agree with me. I think Chris is with us here today. But most members of TREB have oh, hi, Chris.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Most members of TREB have no idea of what kind of lease they are talking about. They will put in, they'll put in gross lease, and then they'll put in TMI. Well, gross lease does not include TMI. All right, they'll put net, and then have TMI for everything. Okay, well, it should be net. It should be triple net. Okay, you're going to see listings on MLS that have net lease, $21 a square foot, net lease. Okay, and then TMI of $14 a square foot. Well, wait a sec, it's not a net lease and $14 a square foot TMI. Okay, a net lease is one thing only that the tenant has to pay, and it's usually real estate taxes that you have to pay. So when you are looking, you know, I have seen some MLS, I have seen lots of MLS leases for commercial, and it says net lease, and then there's zero for TMI. Okay, so it's already, you know, kind of not right because it's a net lease. And it says, you know, there should only be real estate taxes. But then in brokerage remarks, it says, tenant responsible for taxes, maintenance, and insurance. All right. When it comes to commercial leases in the GTA, you guys, and you're looking at these things, for goodness sake, read the whole MLS data sheet that you are looking at. And if it's unclear, for goodness sake, pick up the phone, call the listing agent, and ask what the tenant will be responsible for. There are so many residential agents out there doing commercial leases, and they have no clue what they are talking about. Okay, the lease is wrong right from the get-go. The listing is wrong right from the get-go. And one of the ways that you can tell about the whether the agent has some clue of what they're talking about when it comes time to do a commercial lease listing is the way they have structured the commission to the cooperating brokerage. And if you see a commercial lease that has cooperating brokerage commission of half a month's rent, you know that you are dealing with a residential agent, okay? Because there's a different way to structure commission on a commercial lease. Do you agree with what I'm saying, Chris? I think you've probably seen it all, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of commercial residential agents. They go into that particular issue. So you know, that's always happens, and you always have to call the agent to make sure that's what's happening. And a lot of times you actually have to take them through how to do it. That's the worst part, and you only get paid half of it.
Oh yeah, Chris is absolutely right. My goodness, I know Chris has done it. I know Tom has done it. I know Bob has done it, where there's a listing that their tenant is interested in, okay, and they send off an offer, and don't get a response because the listing agent has no idea. Even worse, you're the listing agent and you get a residential agent putting in an offer, and the listing agent ends up redoing the whole offer and sending it back so that they can get the deal done because the cooperating brokerage has no clue what they're talking about. And one of those tricks that you can look at is commissions. And if it's half a month's rent, you're dealing with a residential agent and they've got no clue what they're talking about. So, okay, Commercial Tenancy Act. The Commercial Tenancy Act is really different from the Residential Tenancy Act, okay? Take everything you know about the Residential Tenancy Act and throw it out the window, all right? The Commercial Tenancy Act. One of the big differences in the Commercial Tenancy Act is the end of tenancy. The right to remain is not automatic. In the residential tenancy world, when a lease expires, it is automatically extended month to month, okay? Just because a lease is ended in the residential world, for those of you who know, I'm sure you'll agree, for those of you who don't know, surprise, surprise, the landlord can't get rid of the tenant, okay? There's only specific ways that a landlord can get rid of a tenant in the Residential Tenancy Act. In the Commercial Tenancy Act, if there's a term is 3 years, there is no reversion to month to month. The tenancy ends unless both parties agree to new terms. And we'll talk about the clauses on how to go about doing that. All right. But that is really, really different. The person who has rented something, started a new business, has a 3-year lease, does not have an option to renew that lease, and all of a sudden they're very, very successful in that location, and the landlord says, I want you out. Guess what? The tenant has to go. There's no falling back anywhere that the tenant can make a case that they want to stay. Okay, the landlord has the right to kick them out, simple as that. There's also no provision in the Act to control rent increases. I think 2020 was a 2.2% rent increase for residential. There is no provision for that. So typically in a commercial lease, the rent increases, usually once a year, are already pre-established prior to the tenant signing the lease. So in year 1, he's paying $1,000 a month. In year 2, he's paying $1,100 a month. In year 3, he's paying, $1,200 a month. All right. Maybe for the whole 3 years, there is no rent increase. It's $1,000 a month all the way through. But that is established at the beginning of the lease, and the landlord cannot arbitrarily raise the rent throughout the term of the lease, except what has been agreed to prior to the commencement date. Okay, simple as that. So in many, many ways, the tenant is kind of protected in the fact during the currency of the lease, the tenant is protected that this is how much it's going to cost for year 1, this is how much it's going to cost for year 2, and this is how much it's going to cost for year 3. Now, what happens if there's a renewal? Well, 2 things there. If there's a renewal that has been already pre-established in the lease that the tenant has the right to renew for a further 3 years, then there's a couple of things. 1, it could already be established, at the beginning of the lease, what the renewal rate will be for the 4th, 5th, and 6th years in this example, but that's pretty rare. What is more normal is that the following 3 years, the renewal 3-year term, will be based upon the rent established, the market rent at that 3-year term, okay? Now, if the landlord and the tenant can't agree on what that rent should be, then often it goes to an appraiser, and the appraiser can establish what market rent is, and the tenant and the landlord agree on what it is. Because of an appraisal report, sometimes the landlord and tenant really don't agree, and the landlord gets their appraiser, the tenant gets their appraiser, and they split the difference of what the 2 appraisers say. so that they come to some kind of fair and equitable solution for the rent. Okay, so there is no provision in the Act to control rent increases, and we'll talk more about rent increases when we get to clauses. Failure to pay, as opposed to the Residential Tenancy Act. As opposed to the Residential Act, failure to pay, if any of you guys are landlords, and I've been a landlord, oh my goodness gracious, it's hard to collect if the tenant's not paying. In today's world, the pretty much rule of thumb is that if a tenant doesn't pay in the residential world, if a tenant doesn't pay and the tenant knows how to play the game really well, they will stay in your property for 10 months. That's about the average now to get rid of a tenant by hiring a sheriff and getting rid of them. It's about 10 months if the tenant really knows how to play the game. Terrible for landlords. And the tenant will finally leave and you won't get any money. In the Commercial Tenancy Act, it's really quite simple. The failure to pay. If the tenant does not pay, the landlord can change the locks on the 16th day rent is due. So the rent is due on the 1st of the month. The landlord is permitted to change the lock on the 16th day, on the 16th day of the month. Really straightforward. It's very strict. And if the tenant does not pay, the landlord can then seize the tenant's property 1 day following default, and 5 days later obtain appraisals and dispose of the property. Okay, it's negated if the tenant pays within the 5 days, if the landlord is taking that route. Now, there's a little more rules about failure to pay that I'm not going to get into. But if a landlord does decide to dispose of everything in the property, he has to get market value for what they are selling. Okay, he can't just fire sale it all away. They have to get market value for it. And if there's anything left over, then the tenant is allowed to get that money back if there's anything left over from what's owed. Okay. No interest. In the Residential Tenancy Act, you get first and last month's rent. The landlord has to pay interest to the tenant for the last month's rent when the tenant leaves. Okay. Landlords are not required to pay interest on prepaid rent or security deposits. Simple as that. The landlord is permitted to take prepaid rent and or security deposits. That's right different from the Residential Tenancy Act. In the Residential Tenancy Act, the landlord security deposit is the last month's rent, and they're not permitted to take anything more. Okay. In the Tenancy Act, I reviewed an offer yesterday. I don't know if Mona's here or not, but I reviewed an offer yesterday where there was a $10,000 security deposit required. All right. The landlord can ask for 20,000. They can ask for $1 million. They can ask for anything. Okay. For security deposits. 24 hours notice. In the Residential Tenancy Act, the landlord is permitted to go onto the property with tenant 24 hours notice. Simple. The landlord does not have the right to enter the premises or have a key to the premises unless specific terms exist in the lease agreement. The landlord's not permitted to go in unless there's specific terms. You can believe it that, what's a good example here? A jewelry store, Burke's. Is Burke still in existence? I don't even know. Jewelry stores. You can bet that the tenant doesn't want anybody to have a key to get into the property if it's a jewelry store, right? It's simply, no, you don't have a key unless there's some kind of specific line in the lease agreement that the landlord has the right to enter the properties. If not, the tenant has the right to not give a key to the landlord. Simple as that. Okay. The Commercial Tenancy Act is very different from the Residential Tenancy Act. Excuse me for one moment. You have to read a landlord's lease very carefully today because they have what's called a demolition clause in leases today. And even if there's a renewal clause, the demolition clause can sometimes override the renewal clause. And the demolition clause states that should the landlord decide to demolish the plaza, the building, whatever it is, so that they can put up an 80-story condo, too bad for your tenant. Okay, the tenant will not be allowed to renew for a further 5-year term if the landlord decides to exercise their right to demolish. So you do have to read the landlord's lease terms very, very carefully. And we're going to talk about this in a minute, that one of the key parts of doing any lease is a tenant's opportunity for their lawyer to review the lease. So if anybody wants to take a picture of this, I'll leave it up on the screen for a minute. This is the website for the Commercial Tenancy Act, the whole thing. All right. If any of you are near the office here, I have a paper that has some stuff on it that goes into a little more detail, but basically it's this. So if you want to take a picture of this website, that is basically a little, well, not basically, it's a more complicated, in-depth look at the Commercial Tenancy Act is at this website here. And so I do recommend if anybody's interested to look at it in more detail. So here we go. Common lease clauses, okay? These are common clauses, okay? Tenants due diligence clause, zoning. The zoning clause is probably one of the misused clauses out there. I have had so many tenants put in offers and the deal has fallen apart because a zoning clause was not included. So how does this happen? There's a restaurant, okay? The restaurant is going out of business, but somebody else thinks it's a great location for a restaurant and they want to run a restaurant. And they go ahead and sign a lease, okay? The problem is that that restaurant that was in existence might be legal non-conforming. And when it's released out to somebody else, that legal non-conforming designation dies, all right? And the existing zoning of the property comes into force and the tenant cannot run a restaurant there. I've run into that maybe once a year in the last 5 years that I've been here, that all of a sudden there's a big problem because now the tenant has moved in all their stuff, they've opened up, and the zoning inspector has driven by and go, well, that's a different name on that restaurant. What the heck's going on? And they go in and they speak to the tenant and they say, you know what, you're not allowed to have this restaurant here. That was a legal non-conforming use. It's no longer applicable. Ladies and gentlemen, for goodness sake, make sure that when you are leasing to a prospective tenant that the applicable zoning is there, okay? You have zoning 01, zoning 02, zoning 03. I think there's about 6 or 7 different zoning clauses. Pick which one fits and put in a condition for zoning, all right? Go to the municipality, ask if their zoning is allowed. Now, I know what Chris is going to say here is that a lot of municipalities today are not answering zoning questions over the phone. As a matter of fact, I believe the city of Markham wants you to show up in person, and before they answer a zoning question, you have to pay $100. You can imagine the number of questions that the zoning guys get at a municipality to see if the zoning is correct or not. Hi, can I put a restaurant in there? No. Okay, great. Next day, well, maybe I won't do a restaurant. Hi, can I put a shoe store in there? No. Okay, next day. Hi, can I put a flower store in there? No. Oh, okay. Next day, hi, can I put a Apple computer store in there? No. Oh, okay. Right? You can just imagine the number of phone calls that the zoning departments get. Actually, I think Ryan was telling me yesterday that now the city of Richmond Hill will not take phone calls. You have to go in person. And guess what? Because of COVID, it's basically closed. You can't get in. And so A, you can't get in to ask, and B, they don't accept phone calls for zoning. Oh no, this is causing a problem, isn't it? How do you find out? Well, you got to be persistent to find out. Obviously, you can get in there somehow and find out. But my goodness gracious, guys, be careful about zoning. Don't assume just because it was a bookstore that you can continue with a bookstore. Not that anybody has bookstores anymore, but that was a bad example because we all have our own Kindles now. But you know what I mean? I can't stress it enough that a zoning clause is put in there. The increase in rent clause, back to you, Gloria. This will answer your question. So what happens at the end of the 3-year term? Well, this increase in rent clause will cover that, okay? Leasehold improvements. A leasehold improvement is what the tenant will pay for, what the tenant will do to increase, to meet the requirements of whatever business they are doing. Leasehold improvements, okay? Environmental. What's going on in the environmental? You have to be careful. Somebody wants to open up a auto body shop and an automotive shop. Well, gee whiz, like, can you? Well, that would be zoning number one. But if it was a if it was an automotive shop before, has there been an environmental impact? So the landlord specifies in this environmental clause that there is no environmental degradation and the tenant can do whatever they want as long as the zoning is good. Signage. This is one that's missed all the time. Signage. Person has leased a property, buys a very nice, a 6 by 12 foot sign, got the crane out front to put the sign up, and the landlord drives by and goes, "What are you doing? You can't put that sign up there." My goodness gracious, ladies and gentlemen, make sure that you know the signage. People who rent in plazas, it's really nice to have a sign on your store in the plaza, but what about the pylon on the side of the street that's got McDonald's at the top and the TD Bank at the top and the next one and the next one at the next one, so people can see what's in that plaza as they drive by on the pylon? You better make sure that if your tenant wants to have some kind of specific signage, that you have this in your lease offer, okay? Parking. Parking's another one that's missed. Is there exclusive parking? Is there only general parking? All right. If it's a small standalone building and you're going to put in something like a small grocery store, you better make sure there's the zoning, because it'll probably fall apart because there's not enough parking spaces. Parking is a huge issue for municipalities, that especially for the sale of a property, but it applies to leases as well. You better make sure that the proper zoning is in place. And one of the reasons why zoning sometimes does not work, actually often does not work, is that there's not enough parking for the intended use of the property. Okay. I was actually at my dentist office just the other day, and he moved. He was at Crosby and Young in that building there. There's all that parking at the back beside the funeral home. And then he decided to rent at Major Mac and Young instead. And he said he had to get a variance for the parking rules because he was short 2 parking spaces according to a dentist office rules on what they needed. And he got a variance that he could do it. But it took him 6 months to get that variance during COVID. He's open now. And he hurts me when I go. But he had to go through that step, okay? TMI. We've talked a lot about TMI, taxes, maintenance, and insurance, okay? Well, TMI in year one might be, I don't know, $16 a square foot, $17 a square foot, okay? But what happens in year 2? What happens in year 3? The TMI escalation clause basically states that the tenant agrees and understands that the TMI will increase in future years, and that the landlord has to prove by way of showing receipts to the tenant on how much the TMI is going to go up. All right, so it's a great clause to make sure that your tenant understands that TMI is not static throughout the whole course of a lease. So back to Gloria's question about a hairdresser, taxes, maintenance, and insurance are going to go up. And so include the TMI clause to make sure that the tenant, your daughter, I think you said, Gloria, understands that TMI is not static. It's going to move, okay? It's going to go up, and the landlord has to prove it. Working chattels, you're all familiar with the working chattels clause for residential, same kind of idea. And free rent. Free rent gets into a whole different complicated thing. There's all sorts of times out there where the tenant would like 2 months free rent so that they can build walls or do some sort of leasehold improvements. Usually when there's free rent, it's only the base rent that is free. TMI is usually still paid for. Okay, lots of good clauses here. And here's more. For the occupation of a sublease, you're going to see that this is the same as the previous slide. This is the same as the previous slide. This is the same as the previous slide, same as the previous slide, same as the previous slide. But now you've got the landlord's approval of the new tenant, and you can see the asterisk beside that. We're going to get to that in just a minute, okay? Tenant's approval of the existing lease. Section 10, Form 515. A sublease form is 515. We're going to talk about forms in the next class. Landlord's warranty that all utilities are paid in full. So you don't want to have somebody taking over a lease in a sublease situation and there's still utilities owing, because then it's going to fall to the tenant, all right? Then we have the TMI is the same, the working chattels is the same, but we have two clauses here with asterisks. So I want you guys to remember these two clauses with asterisks. We're going to get back to it in a minute. Common lease clauses for the occupation of a vacant unit in a commercial condominium. My goodness. Tenant's due diligence. Zoning, once again. Increase in rent clause has a asterisk. Leasehold improvements, free rent, environmental, signage, parking, working chattels, tenant abiding by the condominium rules. And there's another asterisk, and I'm going to surprise you with this on what this is. So these are all the pretty basic clauses that you are going to need when you do leases. Homework. Easy one. Easy. In the lease sections, find the remaining clauses, the four marked with a star, okay, the four marked with the asterisk. You've got 1, 2, and 3 and 4, okay? I have not given you what the numbers are for that. What are the clause numbers on web forms for those 4 clauses? Only 4. I'm only asking you to look up 4, all right? And I don't need the whole clause given to me, just the clause numbers if you want to try them to find them, okay, in web forms. And if you're going to do your homework, please send it to me by next week, Wednesday, if you'd like a response before the class on the 30th. Last but not least, yeah, the next class is October 30th, 10 a.m. And once again, the Zoom info is sent out 15 minutes prior, and we're going to look at commercial clauses for sale and purchases next week. All right. Thanks, Tina. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend. Everybody get outside and enjoy some nice, beautiful weather out there. Have a great weekend, everybody. Thanks.